Good morning, distinguished delegates. Ladies and gentlemen, I trust all of you had a wonderful time last night and a full program that we have designed, the show and the entertainment that we have arranged especially for our event this year. I also hope you take the opportunity to meet up with some old friends, meet new friends. You know, it's been a few years since we had this CEO summit. So I think this is something that we miss and we treasure. So it will be a good time to try and reconnect while we are all here. Yesterday, we had the honor of listening to some phenomenal speeches by economic leaders like President of Philippines, we have President of Vietnam, President of Chile, the Vice President of Peru, Prime Minister of New Zealand, and Prime Minister of Thailand, along with representatives from organizations such as the WTO, WHO, ADB, ICC, WEF, corporate representatives from Meta, Bangkok Bank, Thai Bev, AWS, Google, MUFG, Multi, Central, PwC, Freeport, PTT, J&J. I think I've got everyone. Okay, but it's been phenomenal, and that's the uniqueness of the Apec CEO Summit, where we can pull together the head of policymakers, the head of the economic leaders, with the head of the business leaders and thought leaders together to come on the stage and share the views, debate, and find a way out of where the future will take us and what are we going to do about it. So that is why the CEO Summit is highly followed every year. It's an event that people will put it on their calendar, and it's something that we haven't had in a few years. So we really welcome the CEO Summit this year to Thailand. Today's speakers lineup is no less. We have another full program. We have the highlight will certainly be right after this morning session from the President of France, President Macron, and we have the Vice President of the United States who will be addressing the summit today. And of course, we have the first session with the representative from IMF. We have TAT, the Tourism Authority. We have a representative from CP Group, Krum Thai Bank, Grab, Acer, and Big Grim. I hope I got all of that. So ladies and gentlemen, let me warmly welcome all of you to day 2 of the APEC CEO Summit 2022. I hope you enjoy the rest of today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khun Kasemsit, for your warm welcome and the summary of what happened yesterday, highlights of today. May I invite you center stage because we'll go straight into session number 9, and that's on achieving economic resilience in APEC. And joining the conversation with you on stage, I'd like to invite Mr. Krishna Srinivasan, the Director of the Asia Pacific Department at the International Monetary Fund. So ladies and gentlemen, we get started on session number 9, achieving economic resilience in APEC. Let's begin the conversation.
Well, thank you, and you'll be hearing from me again now. Thank you, Krishna, for doing this and for being on the stage this morning. I think we have a lot to hear from the IMF, being the foremost authority on the economic indicators and your warning sign. To us, your wisdom and your famous economic outlook report is highly followed. It's something that we all have to listen and give us the guidance to where things are going. So I think this is the time where we are living in I would say a crazy time where nothing stays the same and everything seems to move at a crazy speed in every direction. And we have so many indicators to worry about, from politics to food to energy, and is widely discussed at this event since yesterday. So from your recent economic outlook report, you actually said that Asia has generally been spared from the worst of the global economic crisis. So you think that the Asia is actually one of the few bright spots in the world. I would like you to start with the elaboration on this optimism. Give us some positive news in the morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Cass. It's a pleasure to be here. Again, let me put things in context. We're projecting global growth at 3.2% this year, 2.7% next year, with a significant probability that things could fall below 2% for the world economy, and that countries accounting for a third of global output could be in recession in 22 or 23. Now, given that backdrop and the fact that we have growth for US at 1.6 for this year, 1.1% for next year, Euro area 3% this year, 0.5% next year, these are numbers which are quite sobering. In that context, if you look at what Asia is doing, we have Asia growing at 4% this year, 4.3% next year. Now, so in that context, it's a relative bright spot. Now, again, it's all not good news in the sense that if you compare Asia's forecasted growth and you compare that with longer-term averages, the growth is 5.5%. So if you compare Asia's growth of 5.5%, which has been in the past 20 years, and against that you see 4%, it's still a bit sobering. So in that sense, Asia is a relative bright spot, but there are still significant downside risks. And we highlight in our report that there are three reasons why things have slowed in the world and in Asia. One, of course, is the fact that central banks are tightening monetary policy across the globe. The second factor, of course, is the war in Ukraine. And the third factor is, of course, the slowdown in China. So if you put these three factors together, there are headwinds, and these also mean downside risks to growth in Asia.
You make it sound so easy to digest in that short speech. But let me step back a bit. You've been with for 20 years, 30 years?
More than that.
More than that?
27 years, yeah.
You've been around in different regions for IMF. You've seen many crises. How do you gauge this crisis against the other ones that are clearly as big to me in the past?
So this is that we've not seen before. We've had shocks which are back to back to back.
Perfect storm.
Right? Perfect storm in right? You had the pandemic, which is still not behind us fully. In China, the zero COVID strategy, which is a headwind to growth. On top of that, we have the war in Ukraine, and then you have the cost of living crisis. So you have shocks back to back to back, which provides for a very sobering backdrop. You see things growth slowing down quite significantly across most parts of the world, and in that context, Asia is a relative bright spot. Again, within Asia, you see, of course, some of the growth you see is a bounce back from the from the negative impact of the pandemic. You still see some countries, including in Thailand, which are opening up and gradually seeing growth picking up. You also have some structural transformations from the pandemic, right? You've had a big impetus from digitalization, which provides a good impetus for the region going forward, both in terms of addressing the scarring from the pandemic, which we call as long-term losses from the pandemic, and in terms of a world where you could see some fragmentation. So in that context, there are some structural changes in the region, led by the region, which bode well. So I don't want to make it all gloom and doom. There are some good things happening around the world, and I think what we've seen is from the pandemic, the role of digital technology, digitalization, is a very important factor, and that could be an important factor for Asia going forward from here.
Yes, I agree. I think the mass adoption of technology and digitalization over the pandemic years has helped us. But I can't see how we, especially in emerging countries, will be insulated from what is going to happen. And what has just happened this year with the rapid hike in interest rate in the US and the high inflation trigger down to food and energy prices. And I don't see how. I see central banks are very powerless with limited tools to prepare for what is coming next year. I think we have exhausted the fiscal budget since the pandemic. And I really, would like to share your optimism, but I just, I don't have that bright of a horizon for next year.
So again, in terms of what we've seen, inflation has risen across the world, right? In some sense, you saw that rise in other parts of the world much ahead. In Asia, 2021, you didn't see inflation. There's some very specific Asia-related factors there. One is you had a good harvest in India, you had a rebound in the hog population following the swine flu, and then you had rice prices not going up by so much because that is the staple diet here in Asia. So inflation was a lot more muted in 2021. But come 2022, you've seen inflation rise quite sharp in Asia. And in fact, it's not just headline, it's just not food and energy prices. If you look at core inflation, it just tells you that it's broadening, inflation is broadening, and core inflation is about targets across most countries in Asia. So it's very important that central banks address inflation head-on. So you're going to see, interest rates have gone up, you're going to see more financial tightening, and the point we're trying to make is that the risk from over-tightening is less than the risk from under-tightening. Because what we've seen is if you don't address inflation head-on, there's a risk that inflation expectations get unanchored. You see some of the wage price spirals you saw in the past, and that, central banks in this region have gained a lot of credibility. And so in that sense, you want to safeguard that, and so you want to address inflation head-on. Now, this clearly means that with interest rates rising across the region, you have to put this in context of the fact that the share of debt, Asia's share in global debt, has gone up from 25% pre-pandemic to 38% now. So with debt rising, and here I'm talking about public debt, I'm talking about non-financial corporate debt, household debt, there are clear trade-offs, right? Because in some countries you still have output gaps which are negative, debts have risen. So how do countries cope with a higher interest rate? And that's a challenge for policymakers. How do you address this trade-off is something which is there, but we feel that it's important for central banks to address inflation head-on in the current context.
That was actually going to be my follow-up question. How do you, any recommendations to policymakers, especially the government side, the fiscal side, to balance growth against hiking interest rate and capital flight, with the interest rate hiking up on the other side of the world? This is a very tough balance. How are we going to do that?
So our first recommendation is address inflation head-on, because that's important. Inflation is the worst kind of time.
Slamming the brake.
Yeah, so you need to. And given the fact that inflation is still rising, because our analysis finds that core inflation is more persistent. And with a strong dollar, you're going to see greater pass-through to inflation. So inflation needs to be addressed head-on, no question about that. Then the question is fiscal policy. Now, fiscal policy cannot be orthogonal to monetary policy here. So fiscal policy should complement monetary policy. At the same time, there are a lot of people hurt by the pandemic, back-to-back shocks. So what we're saying is, to the extent possible, make fiscal policy temporary and targeted to those affected most by the shocks, and to the extent possible, make it in a budget-neutral way. In other words, cut expenditures elsewhere, raise revenues elsewhere, so that, given the fact that, as I mentioned, debt has been rising, you have to keep that in mind. The other thing is, going beyond monetary and fiscal policy, this is the time to go beyond short term and think about longer term challenges, how to address the scarring from the pandemic, how do you tackle climate change. So there are these medium to longer term challenges which need to be addressed also at the given time.
I think the challenge here is really trying to keep this long-term plan intact for the longer good of the system. Mm-hmm. But of course, it's difficult with political pressure. When food prices are rising, this is right at the bottom of the livelihoods of the general public and the people on the street, and they will be very discontent. They will come on the street and
Sure.
they'll protest, and they will make a lot of noise. They will complain, and makes governments very, very difficult to stay in power and actually try and stay on the course of what they wanted to do. And I think you will see more of this especially in Europe, and it will have repercussion around the world to this part. And any recommendation or any pointers you might have to some of the policymakers who are listening in?
So I think here clearly we see the fact that a lot of people are hurting because of the fact that you've had, like I said, back-to-back crisis. again, you have to recognize the fact that some people are hurting much more than the others. And the fact is that fiscal space has come down across most countries in the region and elsewhere. So that's why we're saying provide targeted support. And here, digitalization gives you a great opportunity to target your measures in such a way that you target your support to the poor and vulnerable. And in some countries, you've been doing that through targeted cash transfers using digital technology. So technology plus the fact that you have a lot of people hurting and the fact that you have fiscal space. So this is three things which you have to take into account. So that's why we're saying provide temporary and targeted support in the context, one, of budget neutral. I mean, make it, to the extent possible, make it neutral, budget neutral. And it's very important at this point in time that governments specify, elaborate, credible, medium-term fiscal frameworks, so that by itself provides you a little bit more fiscal space. Because if you let markets know that, hey, my deficit is higher this year, but I have a plan to address that, through a credible medium-term fiscal framework, that provides a space by itself. So that's even more important at this point in time than ever before.
Very, very challenging times ahead. I don't envy being policymakers this day or regulators. I think they really don't know where to move from here. We are in uncharted territory. I can't help but touch on the subject of geopolitics. While we are trying to regain from the pandemic, trying to come back to business as normal, but we are now facing trading blocks that we have to pick. We have to pick sides at the state level, at the government, at the corporate levels. We have limited access to different markets. We are not on the same side, and now the situation is more complicated by the conflict in Russia and Ukraine. How do you advise emerging countries like Thailand, for example, or some of the emerging economies in this part of the world? How are we going to maneuver in the geopolitical terms?
So again, Cass, a little bit of background here. We've done some work here which looks at what could fragmentation what would it imply for emerging markets. If you look at our report, we have done, so one thing, just to step back a little bit, we've seen that trade uncertainty itself causes a lot of damage in terms of impact on investment, confidence, and so on. So if you go beyond trade, just a talk of trade tariffs and non-tariff barriers, that by itself leads to a greater uncertainty, which affects investment. If you go beyond that, you've actually seen actual tariffs and non-tariff barriers being imposed on some sectors, high-tech sectors, in the context of the 2018 tension between the US and China, and then in the context of the war, you've seen the energy sector being affected. So you have the second phase where you've gone from uncertainty to actual trade tariffs and non-tariff barriers, and then you could have what I would call as a fragmented world. So what we have done in our report, in the most recent report, is we've done an illustrative scenario, a very simple scenario where we say, if the world were to be divided into two blocks, along the lines of how they voted in the UN on March 8th, in response to the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Some said they condemn the war, some said they don't condemn, and some were abstain. So if you think of the world which is fragmented into two blocks, right? And then you ask yourself this question, what does it mean if trade between these two blocks stops, or there's little or no trade? And it is not just these two sectors, the high-tech sector and the energy sector, but it also, if you look at what happens if if these two blocks start imposing non-tariff barriers along the lines of what you saw in the Cold War, what are the impact? And the impact is significant. You see that in such a world, global output could fall by 1.5%, and in Asia, it could fall by 3%. Again, this is a flaw because this analysis is based on the assumption that the effect is through productivity. But if you add other factors, other kinds of fragmentation and other kinds of layers on this, then the impact would be much higher. So in a world where there's fragmentation, the impact on economies, notably in Asia, could be significant. And that's why it's important that everyone moves towards a world where you're open, remain open, do not impose trade restrictions. And Asia has done well in the context of signing many regional trade agreements and so on. That's one way to keep the region open, more integrated, and so on. But beyond that, think in terms of keeping multilateralism going, including the context of reforms of the WTO and so on. So it's an important fact that we all work together to make sure that we remain integrated and this fragmentation risk actually comes down.
I'm wondering if your recommendation is heard by the proper authorities in the policymakers circles. These are very important, and this is something that we've been discussing from yesterday. The rebuilding of trust and confidence to the system. People are not having a lot of them, a real deficit, and that's why people are not listening, and people are just on about what's going to happen. The other issues I'd like to touch on is, in line with this year on BCG. With so much defense budget increasing especially in Europe, and it's the forefront of environmentally and green initiatives. Do you see cutbacks on this green movement that we are trying to go into, and resources are diverted to some of the non-productive and defense area instead of trying to build up the green? As much as we like to talk about it and promote it, it takes time and resources and finance to try and get to that point, and already we are being diverted with the conflict. What is your view on this?
So again, in the context of the war, you've seen that energy security has become an issue, right? So there have been some, backpedaling in terms of moving towards a greener economy and so on. But I would hope that this is just a short-term thing, and once the war is behind us, that efforts are redoubled to make sure that we move towards a greener economy, the transformation continues. And again, I'm just talking to, I was just at the ASEAN summit before this, the G20 and so on. There's clear recognition that we need to work together. So both in terms of keeping economies open, promoting greater trade integration, promoting a greener economy, those themes haven't gone away. So yes, there are these short-term setbacks which come from the shocks from the war and so on. But I clearly sense that there's greater willingness to work together to promote integration, to promote a greener economy, to make sure that everybody is in this together. So I think that theme quite resonated. I came out quite optimistic that we are working, talking in one voice, and there is greater movement towards these factors like integration, a greener economy, and so on.
I like to believe that too. I think we are a bit encouraged from the G20 meeting that the two largest economies are starting to talk to each other, and there are good signs coming out. Do you see that that situation improve, or people are moving to their own corners?
I thought a lot of what we saw during the G20 and also during the ASEAN summit is very positive, is very optimistic. I think people are now leaders, policymakers are meeting each other in person after 2 or 3 years. That by itself is generating warmth and a willingness to work together and so on. So what I saw, what I've been seeing is very encouraging. Again, we all best foot forward, and it's not one country, every country has to do this thing. I think in this region, I see a lot more dynamism, a lot more willingness to be integrated, because any kind of fragmented world, this region risks losing the most, right? So that, in that sense, I can see that, talking to policymakers here, wanting to keep themselves open, using digital technology. The next phase is where, you're going to see a lot more digitalization. How do you open up, greater opening up of the service sector? To go remove barriers to services, trade and services. So all those are things people are talking about. And I think that is, in some sense, a point which we need to bank upon.
Any last word you want to say? I think there's a lot to unpack from your conversation this morning. I think we will have to take time to digest some of this. But any other optimistic words, optimism that you want to share?
So, part of our job is to flag downside risks and so on. So that, in some sense, always leads people to believe that's all gloom and doom. But there is positive momentum out there. And some of the things we talked about in terms of the losses from fragmentation, all that, it's more like a marker to say that let's not go down that route. Because when you go down that route, it's quite bad. Countries which have made huge efforts opening up and they've seen huge improvements in job creation, in reducing poverty, and so on. Let's not lose sight of that. And so when we talk about the risks of fragmentation and so on, it's more to say that let's not go down that route. Let's work towards greater integration, greater openness, address climate change, which is something which I used to work in Latin America, where I used to work in the Caribbean, and I can see you can see that there are countries which are really facing it right now. So we all have to put our best foot forward in addressing these challenges, which may look far out, but they're actually not. We need to go beyond short-termism in policy making and reach out to more things which look medium-term, but actually they're upon us right now. So that's the way. So I'm optimistic that we are heading in the right direction, and we should build momentum along those lines.
So we must have faith and have trust that we will find our way out of this together.
Absolutely.
I think with that, I would like to end the session, and we have a big keynote coming up, so I do not want to be in their way. So thank you very much for this wonderful session this morning, Krishna. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both gentlemen for the stimulating conversation there. Thank you, Mr. Krishna Srinivasan, the Director of the Asia Pacific Department of the International Monetary Fund.